No, anybody who sees that in the future does not know that that's the way I feel. So today, I asked you to read up to page 80 in our book, and I know I'm in a lot of shadows, but page 80 for this. We're going to talk half of that reading for today and talk about up to page 80 for tomorrow. So that means there's no reading for tomorrow's class. So we'll talk about this kind of a bigger chunk of reading. I know it was a bigger chunk of reading that we had for today. We're going to talk about that for today and into tomorrow. So the first half today, second half tomorrow. Then we are going to wrap up the book next week, next Wednesday and Thursday. Those are our last two classes. So we're going to wrap up the book for next week, and there's about 50 pages left of the book from where we're going to end tomorrow. So we end on page 82. I think we end on page 82. And then we'll finish up the book next week, all right? So it's a quick read, like a lot of the reads. It's not necessarily a quick read, but it's a shorter book, like all the books we've read. And I hope that by reading a bunch of these shorter books, we sort of realize that just because a book is shorter or a story's shorter than kind of normal, because an average novel is about 250 pages long. If it's shorter, that doesn't mean there's not a lot of stuff going on, or there's a lot of material in the book to talk about, or that it's not something that's worthwhile. I think when you read a lot of, there's like all these noises happening. Is that you? That's because, you know, a novel is shorter and it still can give us a lot of information. It can still be really fulfilling to read through it. And this is a really short book. So Joe went upstairs.
Yeah, I got
it. Okay. So this is a really short book, but there's a lot of stuff happening in this book. It's a dense book. So we won't get through everything that this book is doing, because this book has been studied and restudied for 60 years now. It's a really important piece of Arab writing. And it's a little bit difficult at times. So if you're having trouble with it, that makes sense, because it's a very lyrical novel, which means the language can feel very poetic. Sometimes you might get lost in the writing, like what's going on? Why is this happening? What's the point of all this? In the narrative. So sometimes it can be very lyrical to the point that you might lose track of a plot or a plot thread. But I think it's also important to think like, okay, why is it lyrical? What's the point of it? It can be very beautiful writing, but sometimes the writing can be very emotionally difficult to get through, especially with Mustafa's story, that he's just a cruel person, just an exploitative person, taking advantage of women, and can be kind of difficult to read. But it makes this question like, who is this character? How much trust should we put into them? Is this a person worth redeeming at all? Do we like them? Or what do we gain from hearing their story? Are they trying to convince us that they've somehow gotten better? So all these questions go into this narrative, right? So what I want to talk about is I was just at the page 50 for today. For 50. That's all we're going to talk about today. And then tomorrow we're going to talk about the second section. So last week we talked about the similarities with this novel, especially Mustafa's narrative and The Stranger and Merceau Investigation. How maybe there's some allusions in Merceau Investigation from this book in terms of Mustafa's character, and that he has this poor relationship with his mother, has this these really kind of negative relationships with women, that he's also they're both very intellectual characters, but and being very smart. They lack any sort of emotional core. They're very cold characters, at least when they're younger. And Mustafa's character is, in many ways, irredeemable as a character. Like somebody that it's like you read, like, why should I even be listening to this person's story? But and he also Mustafa goes on trial for killing a woman, um, Jean Morris. That we find that he went on trial for killing someone, killing Jean Morris. This is on page 28. That he has met all these women while in England. That may have led to one suicide, Anne Hammond, and then meeting all these other women and like basically exploiting them. So this type of narrative is this secret that he talks about earlier on, that there's a secret, that he has a secret life, this history, this past that is very dark, that is very, it is irredeemable, and he goes to prison for 7 years. We find out he's gone for prison for 7 years and eventually sort of leaves prison and travels the world until he returns to Sudan, this village that our narrator, a nameless narrator, finds him in. And then we learn all this story. So some of the things that we should look out for, because this is a post-colonial novel, right? We've been saying this is a post-colonial novel. Some things that we should look out for when reading a post-colonial novel. We talked about beginning last class, the depiction, representation of Europe versus Africa. And Africa in this novel is viewed as very warm, kind of communal. There's a lot of life there from our narrator's perspective. And Europe is kind of cold, England is kind of cold, emotionless. So we have those kind of representations. But then we also, Mustafa sort of plays into these narratives. He plays into it. He plays into the fact that he's African and that these women, specifically Isabella Seymour, sort of plays into that too, that she has perceptions of what an African, or as he calls himself, Arab African, is supposed to be, supposed to look like, and he plays into that so that he can exploit her. That he talks about himself in terms of thinking about Africa as being this sort of idyllic place, but also he talks about himself as an animal at times. He calls himself a crocodile on page 34. He talks about also on page 34 that he lived on the bank of the Nile and he would just put his hand out the window and playing with the Nile waters. So Isabella has this perspective of Africa as being one thing and he is playing it up. He's playing it up for the purposes of so that he can be with her. And he makes up names for himself so that he's never really giving the women his real name. But he is playing into stereotypes. So he's playing into these stereotypes, emphasizing these stereotypes. He says this on page 33, that he transformed into a naked, primitive creature, a spear in one hand and arrows in the other, hunting elephants and lions in the jungle. This was fine. He was happy with that. And he calls himself an Othello character. So Shakespeare's Othello, an Arab African. But Mustafa is exploiting how Europeans view Africans for his own purposes, for his own sort of a little bit of revenge. And so we learn about Mustafa as a young man being this very cruel, emotionless person taking advantage of women, eventually then going to jail for murdering, killing Jean Morris. Because he says kill, we don't know murder, but he says I killed Jean Morris. So this whole Mustafa story keeps going on, right? We talked about last class too, we have this little chapter, sort of a frame narrative. So a story within a story. It goes out of that frame narrative. It moves away from it. In the novel, it becomes a bit confusing in terms of time. So the narrative, if you got confused, like, wait, who's talking? When are we talking? When are all these things happening? That's what this story does. It moves in and out of different time periods, which can make it for kind of sometimes frustrating. Like, what's happening? Who's talking? When are they talking? What time period are when it was all this happened? Wait, Mustafa's dead? When did he die? I didn't know he died. So we're getting all this information that can feel very confusing. Um, but it's our job as readers, like, okay, instead of being confused, be like, okay, the story's changing. Why is it changing? When is this story being told? Because we know this story is being told by the narrator to somebody else, to a group of men. The whole novel opens up with, it was, gentlemen, after a long absence, that I returned to my people. So it's our narrators telling a story to someone, some group of people. So it's at a certain point in time, our narrator is jumping around in time, which makes the narrative itself jump around in time. So it feels confusing. It can feel disorienting. And we have that happen several times. So we find out after Mustafa's narrative, after like what he's gone through in England, that on page 38, that Mustafa has died. He's drowned or something has happened to him. He's died. They don't know what happened to his body. And he has, we find out Mustafa also has a wife and two children, two boys, which is all this new information. And that everything that we've learned about Mustafa, like, he's alive, he's telling our narrator the story, oh, now he's dead. So the story is moving around so much it can feel disorienting. But we're getting little pieces of Mustafa's narrative, also getting pieces about our own narrator's story, where he goes, what he does, and how he gets to places. So there are other things too, questions about who people are. Mustafa sort of repeats this idea of, if I'm a lie, I'm going to make this my own lie. So playing into stereotypes is not who I am. I'm going to play into it. It's something I've created. It's not something somebody has put on top of me. I'm going to play up those stereotypes because I have the power to do so. There's a term called agency. You might have heard this term before. If somebody has agency, they're able to make things on their own, to do things on their own. They're not made into something, but they're making themselves. So if somebody says they have a character has agency, they're making themselves. That's what Mustafa is trying to do. But in doing that, takes advantage of others. But our narrator is like, is Mustafa even like a real person? Is he, as it says on page 39, was he in fact a lie, a phantom, a dream, or a nightmare that had come to the people of that village one suffocatingly dark night? So is he like even a real thing that I should be concerned about? Because our narrator is getting kind of obsessed with Mustafa, getting kind of obsessed with his story. So on page 41, he's still emphasizing this idea of a lie, right? He says, was it likely that what happened to Mustafa Saeed could also happen to me? He said that he was a lie. So was I also a lie? I am from here. Is not this reality enough? I too have lived with them, Europeans. But I live with them superficially, neither loving nor hating them. I used to treasure within me the image of this little village, seeing it wherever I went with the eye of my imagination. So there is this question that our narrator and Mustafa have about who they are as people. Am I something created, or am I making myself, or is it all just fake? Is it all a lie? This is pretty philosophical stuff about who people are. And Africans, for a long period of time, from like the 40s, the 50s, 60s, and the 70s, and into the 80s, in literature, it's like, who are we? Who are we as people? Are we what Europeans tell us we are? Are we something we made ourselves? What are we after independence? Think about like Battle of Algiers, like in Rousseau investigation. Who are we after independence? What have we become? Are we still? Do we view ourselves as Africans? And what are Africans? What does that mean to be African? So a lot of these questions that our narrator's asking, am I allied too? Am I just, I grew up here, I grew up in Sudan, but I also lived in Europe. What does that make me? What am I? Am I a combination of things? What does it mean to be African? What does it mean to be all these different cultures mixed together? Do I have a home? And remember when we talked back last class too, that a lot of Africans, mainly rich Africans, those who could afford it, would travel to Europe for education, France and England for education, and they may not return. But those who did return may have come back changed. Maybe they're not the same sort of have that same African perspective, whatever that may be, but now they have a different perspective. Are they African enough? Are they European enough? What are they? And there is this phrase that the novel also uses, this idea of a Black Englishman or a Black Frenchman, that we're both Black, which has like the signifier, means like African, but we're also European at the same time. What does that mean? What does that make? What does that even look like? So the novel's dealing with a lot of that stuff, a lot of those questions. Who am I? Who's Mustafa? Is he a terrible person? Has he redeemed himself? And the narrator's like, but who am I if I also have a very similar story like Mustafa? I traveled and I came back. What does that make me? If you're really into science and biology in particular, you might have heard like things are hybrids. Plants can be hybrids, right? Mixing different types of plants together. Or you think of like dogs, that can be different types of dogs. Usually, like maybe we don't really call dogs hybrids, but in post-colonial novels, there's a term called hybrid, a mixture of cultures put into one person. So post-colonial novels like deal with the tension between being one thing and also another thing at the same time, being European, but also being African at the same time. How do you deal with that? I have a European education, but I grew up in an African setting. How do those two work together? Do they conflict with one another, or can they work together peacefully? And if I return, will others view me the same way? Will they view me as too good to be African, but not good enough to be European? These are some of the issues, really slightly. It's sort of like in those very lyrical moments that kind of feel like what's going on. It's in those moments that our narrator is dealing with that stuff. And he talks about this, our narrator talks about this on page 41, that idea of, am I a lie? I've lived in both these places, but who am I? And he talks about this more with Europeans, and he says, the fact on page 41 at the bottom, the fact that they came to our land, Europeans, I know not why. Does that mean that we should poison our present and our future? Sooner or later, they will leave our country, just as many people throughout history have left many countries. The railways, ships, hospitals, factories, and schools will be ours, and we'll speak their language without either a sense of guilt or a sense of gratitude. Once again, we shall be as we were, ordinary people, and if we are lies, we should be lies of our own making. This is a big, so that's, again, kind of complicated, but a major thing too in African literature is, what language do we speak? Are we speaking, an indigenous language? Are we writing in Swahili? Are we writing in Somali? Or are we writing in English? Are we writing in French? Are we writing in Portuguese? If I'm writing in English, does that make me African? Does that not make me European, like a European writer or a European language writer? Or what can African language, what can it be? What does it have to be? If I am speaking English in the middle of Africa, I'm participating, like this history of colonialism, I'm a product of that. I'm a product of that colonial history. But I don't think about that. So who am I? So Africa, if this is getting really complicated. I'm trying to make it super complicated. But language is a really important thing to think about. Language can stay in a place for a really long time. Language is history. What a person speaks, what language they speak, is part of the history of that place, of that location. There, there's this common sort of thing um, about like World War II. If so, we didn't beat Germany, Nazi Germany in World War II. We all be speaking German right now. Like there's that common refrain. Yeah, because I'm not saying it to be true, but language, where language travels, means one group of people dominated another group of people, and that language became the dominant language. So where a certain language exists, it's because there was violence there, because there was conflict there. Something happened where one language takes over another language. Um, so our narrator here is questioning that. I'm speaking English, but I'm not questioning it. Why am I speaking English, potentially? He says, without sense of guilt or a sense of gratitude. Just sort of, I do it, I speak it, but I don't think about it. That's part of hybridity. I am this thing, but there's a conflict in doing that thing or being that thing. I'm a mixture of a bunch of different stuff put together. How do I think through all that, those combinations of ideas? I know this is a little bit complicated, I'm sorry, but it's sort of what to look out for with post-colonial novels. What I'm really concerned about, not concerned, like what I really want you to take away from this novel is not so much all like the small details, it's what African literature is trying to think through. Because this is a novel about who am I? Who are we as a people? What have we become? How did we get there? And where are we going to go in the future? A lot of big questions, a lot of major questions about life and culture and society. So the little individual stories are not like the major issue here. It's the bigger questions. How do we respond to being colonized for hundreds of years? How do we make ourselves new? What do we take from our history? What do we make new? That's the whole experience of a post-colonial novel, right? That's that whole idea. So these smaller questions about what a character does, they matter. They do matter. Why should we care about these characters? But also the questions they ask about themselves. Who am I as a person? What's my history? What's my past? Where do I want to go in the future? How do people view me? Do I play into stereotypes? Am I living a stereotype? Or am I combating a stereotype? These are all questions that a lot of North African writers are asking themselves. And just a lot of African writers in general are asking themselves. So these little parts of the novel make up a larger image of what it means to try to understand a post-colonial world, a world after colonialism. I know I just spoke at you for a long, long time, and I apologize for that because I'm also working through understanding the book. That's how I work through it, especially by spewing things out. So, do any of you have any thoughts, either on what I just like blurted all out, or anything that we've read for today, from up to page 52? Do any of you have any thoughts or questions, or anything that popped out to you as you read through? No. Okay. I'm just looking at all the microphones. They're all saying red. So what I want to do is also briefly, and then we'll end it for today, is end our talk about this section with how Mustafa has been viewed by others, because he's become kind of a myth, and others seem to view him not from knowing him personally, but as a story told that one person can become this bigger thing than they actually are, that their story is greater than who they actually were as a person. And we get this on page 47 through 50. That 46 through 50, that one person thought they heard of him as marrying an English woman. In fact, he was the first to marry a European of any kind. That he became part of the British government, that he's a millionaire living like a lord in an English countryside, which is a different story about Mustafa, becomes something other than what he actually is. We know that's not true. We know Mustafa has died. At least from our narrator's perspective, he has died. We don't know how he's died, but he has. And on page 47, that there's all these possibilities, these countless possibilities of who Mustafa Said could be and who were his sons and things like that. It could be anything that we imagine. And that sort of on page 49, all these stories, the stories that we tell about others have power to them. And that sometimes, they're telling a story about Mustafa. We know he's not a good person. Yeah, others view him in this very powerful light. Look at this person from Sudan who achieved all this greatness, even though it's not true. The story matters. The facts don't matter, but the story matters. Because the story can outlive the facts. A really good story, a really powerful story can outlive the facts of a situation. So that the story becomes the truth and the facts sort of like are not the truth anymore. Like they don't matter as much anymore. You can probably think of examples of American history or American historical figures where a myth has been created around them and that the facts aren't as important as the myth. I think of like George Washington, for example, cutting down the cherry tree, right? Super strong, cutting down a cherry tree, or he doesn't tell a lie. Those aren't necessarily true, but the stories are true and they've lived on for 300 some odd years. And that story matters more than the truth. Or that he had wooden teeth. I think he had some wooden teeth, but not all wooden teeth. Like there's a certain things we tell about a major American figures, whoever they may be, and the myths are more important than the facts. And Mustafa has become more of a myth than anything else. And it's powerful for those who tell the story. So there's on page 49 here, there's this long little section here that Mustafa, this man that our narrator meets on a train that Senda no Mustafa says, talks about this. Says, he's telling the story about how Europeans viewed Africans. And these Europeans say, look how tolerant and liberal we are. This African is just like one of us. He has married a daughter of ours and works with us on equal footing. If you only knew this sort of European is no less evil than the madmen who believe in supremacy of the white man in South Africa and the southern states of America. So South Africa, apartheid and racism, Ku Klux Klan in the southern states of America, but also throughout America in general. If only he had stuck to academic studies, he'd have found real friends of all nationalities, and you have heard of them here. He would certainly have returned and benefited with his knowledge, this country in which superstitions hold sway. So this guy is critiquing Sudan, where superstitions are still important. Myths are still important. And here you are now believing in superstitions of a new sort. And there's always questions about what does it mean to be African, especially as they're trying to achieve independence. Like children, you believe in that the bowels of the earth lie as a treasure you'll attain by some miracle, and that you'll solve all your difficulties in the garden of paradise, fantasies, waking dreams. Through facts, figures, and statistics, you can accept your reality, live together with it, and attempt to bring your changes within the limits of your potentialities. So this guy's like, no, you need facts. You need facts to get through things, not stories, not imaginings. Facts are more important than the stories. So we're having some conflict here. Stories can live for a long time, and the facts get sort of erased But in order to achieve a good world, perhaps the facts have to get to the forefront. So we have this conflict, facts versus stories. Doesn't mean they can't live together, but they're combating. And that's what we're dealing with. Things that are in conflict. A world that's being made. What do we trust? Who am I as a person? Do I trust the stories I've been told about myself, or do I make something else? How do we create a new world or a better world from our history, our past of colonialism? Where do we go from here? We've taken from Europeans, but we're African. Who are we? This is at the heart of post-colonial novels. And we're going to talk about this a bit more for the second section for tomorrow. Again, I know I apologize. I've been talking at you for a long time, but I really love this stuff. So that's why I keep talking about it. But we're going to end it for today. We'll talk about the second half for tomorrow. So if you hadn't had a chance to read through the second half of tomorrow, so page 52 to 80, we'll talk about that for tomorrow. That's for tomorrow's class. And then next week, we'll wrap up the book. So I'm going to send out next week's reading. I should get it all scanned and sent out to you by tomorrow evening. It takes me a while to scan everything through because the app I use keeps crashing and it makes me very, very angry. But we'll finish up the book for next week, okay? So it's about 50 pages until the end of the book. Anybody have any questions? I know I just spouted everything, but anybody have any questions? All right. So I will see you all tomorrow. All right. And have a nice rest of the day, everybody. Bye.